robots that we have around, put them in an audience, bring a comedian to deliver it with the real audience as well, and then the bot starts laughing, ha ha ha, and nobody else is laughing, stops laughing. It'll be awesome. An awesome experiment in hybrid reality of the future.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody should do it.
All right, so Nebojsa, do you want to step into the frame, just so that the camera can catch you? All right, everyone please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Nebojsa. Nebojsa is a principal researcher at MSR AI. He's been in the business of deep learning for a really long time. And today he's going to take us through a problem that he's been addressing, which is constructing land cover maps. And he's going to show us how a lot of the objective functions that we've set up and the algorithms that are currently being pursued in deep learning today are not quite sufficient in tackling a realistic problem like this. And maybe he will give us some pointers on how to ask better questions, which will help us in our research. So I'm going to let him take over. Thanks, Nebojsa.
Thank you, Samira. And now I'm going to sit down because I'm sick. So, as I mentioned in a reply to Samira, to all of you, this is going to be more about some ideas of what should be done in the future than about what has been done already. So it's not going to be rich on numbers. It's going to be rich on images and some sort of thoughts. The slides are kind of a mix of things that I put together real quick for this. These people that I'm mentioning here are on the thing that I was talking about at MIT, but there are more people involved in this project. However, the first three are the interns who worked really hard on this problem and are working still as contractors or simply working on it from grad school. Bistra Ilkina is an advisor of one of them. But then these next two people, Rachel and Jacob, they are from Chesapeake Bay Conservancy, and they are the actual users of these sort of maps. So we are partnering with them to figure out what's actually needed and to try to solve real problems. The thing that actually this whole presentation is about is that the land cover mapping, even though it's a special case of computer vision, it's a special case of semantic segmentation, it actually demonstrates big issues with traditional ML paradigms. And what I mean by traditional ML paradigm is that usually you create the data independently from all the algorithms that are going to be tried on, or you pretend that you're creating independently. And then the data set is curated also separately, labeled and whatnot. And then you have a competition. A bunch of people come with their ML algorithms and they're trying to fine-tune them to this data to see who has the best algorithm, because it's about machine learning, so it's about machine learning models, which one is the best. It's not about the data, right? Of course, in the end, you're using this machine learning algorithm to create new labels, new data. And in some cases, you can see that the goal are these labels. And land cover mapping, that's one of these cases, because there's so much unlabeled stuff, and you need these labels because people want to move on and make decisions, policy decisions, for example. So they don't care whether you're going to do this manually or with the algorithm. They just want it done. And so in land cover mapping, then some of the traditional issues in machine learning kind of come into the focus. I said that the usual thing is you have the data created first and then you train the algorithms, but there are some deviations. Like people will say, well, we don't have a lot of data in some new area, and so we're going to do domain adaptation, zero-shot learning, one-shot learning. These are all sort of ways of getting around this issue that the real use applications aren't really that you create a data set, sufficient data set first, then you train the algorithm second. It's more like, it's more, there's all active learning as well, so it's more sort of an iterative procedure. But we usually push that under the rug, and we're pretending that it's just data and then algorithms. The other place where it really doesn't work like this is the actual ML, because when you read a paper, and I've been a grad student to read papers as well, and I wrote a paper with this brilliant new simple generative model and showed how it works very well. And then a year later, somebody wrote a paper where they said, well, you shouldn't be doing it like in his paper, you should be doing it in these ways, because it usually doesn't work if you're not doing it in these ways. And I said, that's how I was doing it, but I mean, it's not a nice paper if I talk about these things. It's obvious, you're supposed to figure it out. What I'm getting at is that often these different machine learning algorithms, the best one, the second best one, the third best one, the results have to do with the student, not the model. They're all using the same model, more or less, but they figure out how to fine-tune it to work for that particular application well, and that's also something that's not there. But, so in other words, if you think about machine learning from the point of view of augmenting labor, then you're augmenting the labor from labeling, and you're also augmenting the labor from fine-tuning the models with these techniques. But we never talk about it that way, talking about information that you gain from humans with the help of the computers, which is what's actually happening. So my point is, all machine learning is really hybrid intelligence, but we're pretending that it's not. However, if you accept it like this, then you can create new sort of ways of doing things, which I'm going to allude to here, and it could be actually very exciting. So the outline for this, I'll talk about the motivation for this particular problem, although I gave you the motivation for the higher level motivation from the machine learning point of view. But I'll give you now a motivation for the land cover mapping. I'll talk about the data, the challenges that are there, and then I'll show you this browsing, debugging, testing, deployment tool, which is kind of flashy images where you can zoom in everywhere in the world and see how your model works and so on. Because that's actually a beginning of a tool that allows this sort of hybrid intelligent approach to land cover mapping, as I'll explain. And then I'll mention at the end that one of the cool goals would be to have a land rush where a bunch of research groups and a bunch of end users of land cover mapping come in, working both as humans and machines to cover the entire United States really quickly. And what they get for it is their name associated with every pixel or whatever, the citations, the tables of how well different things have worked, how much they help. That's the other thing that you have when you have multiple algorithms in a competition. You have that the first one has 95%, the second has 93%. Now, is it because the first one got everything right that the second one did plus 2%, or do they have different errors? If they have different errors, then you should be somehow ensembling them, but that doesn't happen because they're competing in isolation. Instead, you should have been building them together. So you could have this setup where people are working on just covering the land automatically, semi-automatically, with certain set of tools we provide, but in the end you can give everybody credit in terms of the bits of information that they have actually contributed. And it could be that one label created thousands of bits of information, or it could be that it didn't do anything because it was already baked into the cake. So for the motivation, the land cover mapping is actually a really hard computer vision problem, but it's usually looked over because it doesn't look maybe as fancy as detecting cats in videos, and also it's too hard, it's too serious. In computer vision community, we actually really try to stay on toy problems. I have to admit. I mean, so even when they look like they're real, we often kind of hide. But there's of course nowadays there's lots of examples of real kind of computer vision, and then things become hairy, like autonomous driving, for example, and so on. This is one of these real applications of computer vision. It's been around for a long time, and the reason why it's useful is so these are some of the main United Nations goals regarding standard of life on the planet. And you have clean water and sanitation, which is aided by these maps. Sustainable cities and communities, also aided by these maps because you can track the urban sprawl and so on. And then also, of course, agriculture and conservation applications and so on. They're all based on looking at things from the map. Often even the data that we do have in some digital form, like building footprints, plans and whatnot, they are so scattered across different agencies that people find that it's easy to just come and look from above and figure out what's actually happening. Now, why do we need, I'm going to talk about high resolution land cover maps, which are at 1 meter resolution or even finer. So for every meter squared of the United States, we want to be able to say what that piece of land is. Is it impervious? Is it a tree? Is it a field, or water? Those 4 categories would be the very basic categories, but you can have hundreds or thousands of other things that you might be interested in. Now, why does it need to be high resolution? Because detecting urban sprawl requires actually that you look at fine-grained things, like a new parking lot being added here or a new building. And to detect that at the blurry images that Landsat gets at 30 by 30 resolution, it's hard because texture and color change are not really very indicative of anything. And so classifying everything into these 4 categories will help you say whether you've actually moved from a field here to concrete or not. The other application, and this is where Chesapeake Conservancy is really interested in, it's the idea of studying these riparian buffers. And if you've lived in Seattle for a while, you've heard about this a lot. The shadow around the streams, so that our salmon can come up, but basically for protecting the habitat around the rivers and protecting the rivers from pollution has a lot to do with planting the right sort of trees around. And when it gets barren, you can see that if you have a nice map like here, you can kind of tell what's going on, how much field do you have, how much and how much trees do you have, and it's especially important around the water edge. Then, as I was mentioning, urban sprawl and conservation efforts. Those are the finding change and so on. And now, why does it need to be high resolution? So here's the example of the high resolution image and the high resolution labeling of this. The existing low resolution labeling, this is an LCD and it's about 7 years old. The new one is supposed to be coming soon. So this is very rarely updated, this stuff. They basically just describe every 30 by 30 square by a description that says this is low intensity urban, or this is mostly open field, or this is open water, or this is a mix of deciduous and evergreen forest, and things like this. So then at that labeling resolution, this is what you know about this data here. You don't really see a new house here if it was built, or you don't see the roads and so on. So now I'm going to set this as a goal, accurate high resolution land cover map, but really that's just the starting point. There's lots more that can be and should be done here. And I'll be working on this 4-class problem for a while here: water, forest, field, or impervious problem at 1 meter resolution. Now, the labeling is really problematic, and it's kind of hard to really, unless you start going to Google Earth or some other map and start zooming around, it's kind of hard to understand how many of these square meters there are. So if you imagine having a traditional tool and start labeling pixel at a time, obviously it's impractical. Now, Chesapeake Bay Conservancy actually did decide to do this for Chesapeake watershed, and this is the part that they actually labeled.
The black outline?
Yes.
Okay.
And they labeled this semi-automatically, not manually. So they first ran a segmentation algorithm that gave them some polygons. Then the polygons were classified using random forests, and then they looked into the polygons, and then they found where the errors are, and then created some 100 different rules about when to apply this or that algorithm, all by hand. And they spent 10 months and $1.3 million to do it. And so now we have some ground truth data. Now the question is that ground truth data useful? And by the way, that ground truth data is way bigger than ImageNet, right? However, that's only 2% of the area of the United States. And Chesapeake, I'll show you later, doesn't look at all like Florida, or like Arizona, or like California. So now what would happen if we decided, well, let's just do it the same way for the rest of the United States and make labels everywhere so we can train our algorithms? Well, you can't really scale that up because this is only 1/50th of the entire United States. This is what that area looks like. It was divided into these tiles. This is what one of the tiles looked like. On the left is the image. On the right is the segmentation that we can use because they created it as ground truth for us. Segmentation is not perfect. As you can see here, there's some pieces of the road missing, and there's some errors. There's like over prediction of the field in between the 2 lanes of traffic and so on. But this is just the beginning for this problem, because we're talking about these images that were acquired by airplanes, by USDA's airplanes, and they're done every couple of years, and they're at 1 meter resolution, and it's already huge. As I was saying, it's bigger than the ImageNet. However, Planet Labs is actually getting this level of resolution several times a day of the entire globe. And actually, we are going to get data from them for Chesapeake, just to compare. We should be like several weeks, just every day, seeing the images there. And then there are new startups coming up all the time in this space, and some of them are planning to have video frame rate of at high resolution so you can imagine how much data there is there.
Nebojsa,
Yeah.
is it fair to say that we can get away with low resolution because the amount of change in low resolution
Yeah.
is not as much as high resolution?
Yeah, but then you can't detect change until it becomes big.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But they want to detect change before it's big. Like they want to know that somebody has paved part of the bank, right?
Okay.
Which isn't supposed to be paved because, or for example, cities will do drain water planning, and when they do drain water planning, I mean the sewage system and the stormwater collection. Which I've seen in some places where they're working on. This is a really tough thing to do because if you don't estimate how much water is going to go there, it just starts popping out everywhere. And I've seen it actually happen in Bellevue where they've worked on this for months, and then the first bigger rain and it's just popping out like geysers on the sides. And one way to plan is to know how much built area there is. That's the main actually determinant of how much stormwater planning you have to do, how much stormwater you have to take, and that ends up being easier to do from the air. And then also, as I was saying, the conservation efforts and so on. Okay, so the data I mentioned already, it is 43 terabytes. That's compressed. A Landsat is much smaller. Because it's a 30-meter resolution, and we only take for Landsat we only took 2 snapshots averaged, and for Landsat you can also get it per week, and we only had two average snapshots. And then the land cover labels, we played with Chesapeake labels that I just showed you, but we also played with LCD labels that I also showed you, these very low resolution labels. And then the NAPE imagery has 4 channels, RGB, but also near IR, and covers the entire United States. Now, you can have these variations, time of day, time of year, the different sensors. Landsat looks like this. I'm showing only RGB here, but it has actually 8 channels, several different infrareds. The entire United States is covered every 2-3 weeks.
Can you get away with using fewer channels? Do you need all the channels?
Probably not. Probably not, because we get pretty good results with just RGB NIR in the high resolution images. But these are 1,000 times smaller images, so why not keep all 8 channels? Right? This is when you average the surface from Landsat across the months from between April 1st and September 30th, when the leaves are on, and this is with leaves off, and those are the 2 things that we use as input to our predictions. And then these are the 4, as I mentioned before, the 4 classes we're trying to predict. That's for this thing here, this image here. So we basically have parallel images, image like that, and the Landsat version, which is much lower resolution for this, and then we have labels like this. But in some cases, we don't have labels like that, we have labels like this, right? Outside Chesapeake, we do have labels, but they're like this. Now, we want high resolution segmentation, even though we have 30-meter labels, though. Now, these labels, as I mentioned before, they come in these descriptive forms. Like they'll say deciduous forest versus mixed forest versus scrubland, grassland, herbaceous, and so on and so forth. And you can translate them into our 4 classes probabilistically. You could say that, for example, open space, developed open space, means that there is some impervious surface, but very little. Whereas low intensity developed means that there's 20% of impervious surface, and so on. So we can turn them into these statistical descriptions across our 4 classes. Okay, so the challenge is, I already talked about data. Now, the challenge, and I alluded to this, is that knowing everything you need to know about Chesapeake, and we don't know it very well because there are errors in labels, but even if we knew everything about Chesapeake, that doesn't mean that we know everything about the United States. It's very different. For example, even within Chesapeake area, the distribution over the 4 classes in Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia is very different. So if you train model on just blindly without balancing the classes and so on, then obviously you're going to predict forest everywhere if you train on Virginia and then classify it somewhere else. So that's a trivial thing you can deal with, but there are other less trivial things, like these are distributions over the raw pixel values in Maryland, New York, and Iowa for different LCD classes, and you see that they just vary wildly, just going from one state to another. And you can imagine what would happen if I now somehow showed you the same thing for texture rather than raw pixel values.
Should forests look approximately the same, like no matter which state it's in?
They don't, for a couple of reasons. One is that you have different trees, and they can be actually silver to green to dark green to. And the other is that the climate is different and imaging conditions are different, so things look very different. And then the other reason is that some forests are denser, some are sparser, so then the texture, the shadows that you get, the forest is really like dark green versus almost black, some sort of a texture from above, but that texture can vary dramatically from type of forest, from a state to a state. And then if you move from a place that's like Chesapeake and you move to Colorado, which is mountains, then suddenly it looks even more different because of the slopes and so on. So you're not used to seeing them at a slope and so on. So things look very different. And so what happens is that if you take the out-of-the-box deep learning algorithm, like any of your semantic segmentation networks, and you train it on Chesapeake, basically you take this high-resolution input, chop it up into blocks, have this network make predictions for these different blocks, have your cross-entropy cost, propagate it back, learn for a long time, run it. It works. First of all, it doesn't work perfectly in Chesapeake. You get 92% accuracy, no matter how hard you try. You can't actually overtrain. And the second of all, when you move to a new place in the country, for example here, these colors are not very informative, but everything is predicted to be forest. And this is actually in Iowa, and these are crops. But they have texture in the crops, and this texture is confusing the algorithm because he hasn't seen anything like that in Chesapeake, and he thinks this is forest rather than just a field of grass.
The 92% on Chesapeake, that's relative to the labels that were also obtained semi-automatically.
Yes, and some of these.
Do you have some sense of the error in those labels?
Yeah, we do have some sense of the error in those labels. They have measured those errors, and they also think that their labels are 90% accurate. However, we can see their algorithm fixes some of the label mistakes. So it isn't. I mean, if their labels were inaccurate 10% of the time at random, that wouldn't be a big problem because the algorithm would cut through that. But if there is a bias in how they make errors, then the algorithm is going to learn that and make the same errors. However, the main issue that's why we made that tool that I'll show you later to investigate things. Once you start, instead of looking at numbers, once you start looking at images, then you realize that the main issue coming from one area to another area is that the input statistics are very different.
Could you combine this automatic detection with something else that like confers with a map? Because in maps, right, we know roughly what it is.
Right. You mean labeled maps?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Logical maps. Yes,
Exactly.
I'll talk about that. Yes, you can add other sort of data to help and so on. Yeah. Okay, so now to solve this problem, you can have more data. In our case, we're using a Landsat and multiple years of NAPE images, so you have multiple versions of seeing the same thing. You can also do color augmentation. You can encode certain invariances into the model, which I'm not going to talk about. One interesting thing is using these low resolution labels to learn the high resolution classification of the terrain. We call that label super resolution. The idea is that you have pairs of high resolution images and low resolution labels, and your algorithm is supposed to figure out what the high resolution labels should look like to agree with your low resolution labels. And the way that works is, as I mentioned earlier, is that for every one of these LCD classes, we actually can estimate what they mean in terms of our 4 classes. When LCD says it's open water, that means 97% of the pixels of water. We also have an idea of how much variance there is. And we can get that by looking at parallel statistics between the NLCD labels and the high resolution labels. But also the NLCD labels come like this, described like this. The open water means at least 80% of water, for example. For developed open space, we know that it's 46% field, 42% forest usually, and impervious is only 11%, and so on.
Within the low resolution labels, when you want to predict the high resolution labels, have you tried some kind of structured prediction approach?
Structure? What do you mean by that?
Like a graphical model, for example, as it encodes this as a prior.
Yeah, I'll show you what we do.
Could
Yeah,
you
it's something similar to that. Yes. Yeah. But there is the graphical model, the unsupervised models I'll talk about at the end, but what you see as a solution is probably what you're thinking about. So here is the, so this is the goal. Repeat it again. We have pairs like this, high resolution image X, and then low resolution label, set C, where each of these things are described statistically, like that dark blue pixel means impervious is 20% to 49%, the rest is fields and trees, and so on. And then what we want to get is the label super resolution. You can find the paper on Open Review for all the details. And the way it works is actually fairly simple. You take your semantic segmentation core, it could be any network, anything that's trainable by gradient descent, and it is supposed to predict high resolution labels, which we don't have. But if it does have these predictions, then we can count how many of each kind we had. And so we can have a distribution over the labels inside that block. And that's really a distribution that takes into account the uncertainty of the model as well as the prediction. It can tell you that the model so far expects that this distribution with this much uncertainty. This is the variation over the classes with this much uncertainty. In fact, since you're adding up a lot of pixels, or a lot of probabilities for different labels actually, then the distribution over these is actually Gaussian. So all you have to do is to just compute the mean and variance from your binomial distribution and represent the statistics as a Gaussian distribution over these means with these variances. And so that's what represents your block. But then over here you have the label for that block, and now you can compute the KL distance between what you're expecting to see and what you're actually seeing. So far, the network is hallucinating that is, and that's your cost, and that actually can propagate all the way through the network. And so the only question is, does it work, right? And of course, it works. Otherwise, I wouldn't be mentioning it. And so basically, the core network was a unit of this structure, and then you start with this, and I'm showing here that same representation in this form, where I've turned these discrete labels of different colors into colors that represent my 4 labels, where I'm using dark green to be trees, light green to be fields, brown to be impervious, and blue to be water. And then for every one of these blocks, I average based on the expected distribution for that NLCD label. I average these colors and show them, so you see this. So this is basically what I have as ground truth. And then as I train this model, what happens is that very quickly the model starts seeing some structure. We still see the blockiness from the NLCD labels, and then it gets this guess, which is very high resolution but inaccurate. And then over time, it actually fills it up and figures out what these things are. So you go from here to here. So that's the label super resolution idea, right? You can now, this allows us to train on data from everywhere in the United States. So then what we try to do is to train with some high resolution labels from Chesapeake and some low resolution labels from everywhere in the United States, joint algorithm where the core is either trained within the label super resolution framework or outside, but the gradients go from all the data. And then we try to see whether with all of these tricks we can do relatively well. And the first idea is to separate Chesapeake into two parts. This is going to be for testing, and the lower part is going to be for training. But we also want to see what if we just train on Maryland, just one state, and test over here, or if we train on all of the South Chesapeake. And then you get something like this, where the more you try, the more you do. You combine super resolution with some color invariances. You add Landsat and multi-nape imagery. We also added the existing building footprints that we could download somewhere. You can get all kinds of things. Now, in this case, we didn't do building footprints, but we have a solution that uses that as well. And then your accuracy, of course, grows. It's interesting that you can actually generalize from Maryland alone to 90%. But of course, if you use more training data, you get 90.9%. And so, so this is just some examples of classification. It also shows you how much variation you have in appearance of things. And so this is the best model so far. It looks more reasonable than if you just use a regular neural network or a random forest. Interestingly, random forests are just as bad, or neural networks are just as bad as random forests in some cases, because of this huge variation in data. The interesting thing here, though, is that in GIS community, they never do this, what I just described. They don't actually, from what I know, they don't actually say, well, let's build one model that's going to cover the globe or the entire United States. They say, let's map this area. And so they will work on some data for that area. And if you look at the CVPR workshop last year, that's how it was run. The competition was run, where Planet captured some images, paid for crowdsourcing to label these images, and it's very, like, I don't know, much smaller than, I mean, it's just one city, one town, and then they gave it out and say, well, let's just do the regular Kaggle kind of competition, see who makes the best predictions in a new area, with the understanding that's going to work in that area, nowhere else, right? Now, the interesting thing is when you're trying to do something like this, let's make a whole map of the United States, which we did. We have 2 so far. Then how do you even evaluate it? Because we don't have test data. And so one way is to just look at the agreement within LCD labels which we have. We look at our map and say how many catastrophic errors you have. And the bluer the map, the better we are doing. Now, around Roswell, for some reason, we don't have any data. So we don't know how well we're doing there. But you can see that where we're doing well is like Pacific Northwest, which looks similar to this. No, we don't do well in agricultural areas of California or in the middle of the country. But you kind of get the idea of how well you can do. Now the question is, when you have something like this, how do you actually use it? Because it might be too bad for any use. Now you have to refine that somehow in a particular area. So Chesapeake people were interested in mapping Iowa Cedar River watershed. And so they looked at our results, overlaid them with, we sent them the map. They overlaid it with in the tool that they have, the GIS tools. And then they looked at what sort of mistakes we are making, and they decided that there are certain types of things, like our model tends to hallucinate low vegetation or field next to the road because that's what it usually sees. So then it doesn't really capture all these trees across over the roads. And then there are some other things that they complained about, like rounding of objects, such as houses, which we're doing a little bit better on now, that we're using building footprints rather than their predictions of buildings. And then the other thing is seeing the shadow as water. These models very often see shadows as water or roads as water. They see a lot of water, and that's one of the things that's typical of every intern who tried this with all kinds of tools. They overpredict water usually. And so they spotted these things, right? And then they said, well, we're going to find a few areas where we see a lot of those things, and we'll just do it by hand for you. We'll spend 30 hours, and we'll label those pixels and send them back to us. And then it turned out that you can just go, let me see, where is that? I want to find that network that I showed you. It turned out that when you go here at the last level, you have these 64 filters, and then you go up and get the 4 classes. What you can do is just add one layer here, which transforms these 4 classes with a matrix. Just adding that, and you can just retrain that. That's just a logistic regression model on their labels, and just add that on the top, and that solves like 90% of all the errors in the area, right? Which then says this task is extremely difficult, but on the other hand, it's very simple. I mean, the model is already capturing all kinds of texture, all kinds of information. You need to refine it, right?
Actually, why does that work? I didn't completely follow. Like, you corrected all the water. Like, how does it actually just?
So basically, the
really
model decides that the shadows
Yeah.
when so the model outputs the shadow, the probability of the the probability of the tree there, probability of the field there. It's a mix, right?
Right.
Probability of the water as well, and the water is the most likely, but not the only
by
thing that's
how
likely.
much?
So you have these 4 probabilities for field, water,
Oh, I see.
tree, and impervious.
Sorry.
You multiply those 4 probabilities with a matrix, and that gives you the new 4 probability. Well, you take that matrix also through a logistic regression,
Right.
through a sigmoid, softmax,
So you
and
train
then
it,
you
basically.
and then you just train that matrix,
Right.
and that's super fast. You can do that on the fly, right?
Right. You're kind of fine tuning your network on
That's
top.
right, on top,
of
yeah.
doing that transfer.
And you can imagine that this is the simplest thing you can do. It's just basically changing biases towards different land classes.
It's
But
a
you
bit
can imagine,
surprising that
yeah.
works, right? Because you're operating on each label kind of independently now. Whereas if you look at this, you say, okay, if I have a narrow strip of water near other colors, maybe
That's
not
right.
actually.
That's right. That's right. So you can imagine now that these corrections could be done differently. For example, we could have gone the layer down where there's 64 features and retrained that part 64 to 4,
Yeah.
right? Or it turns out that gradient descent actually is highly regularized by itself. So when you train gradient descent through these networks, it's very hard to go far away from where you started. And so you can just overtrain on a small amount of data, and you're not going to forget everything you've seen before. So you could also just do a gradient descent back through the network and update the parameters. And I'll show you some other things you can do. But the point here is that it's not that hard to go from really bad to really excellent if you have the starting point.
So those extra data that you got when you retrained just that matrix, that
Yeah.
wasn't. Did you retrain the whole thing, or you only retrained one?
Only the matrix. We kept the core of the model the same.
Does it make the model worse outside of the area you're trying to?
Yes, it makes it worse in Chesapeake, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this is an example of how quickly you go from this thing is originally it's predicted like this, but it's missing the water here, and their corrections are like this, but we can, by reweighting our network, we can get to this very quickly. And so it is actually it's all there. The reason why we try to do all of this way is with a tool, which I'm going to show you in a moment. You can see the probabilities, and we can see that when it's predicting that it's road or forest and it should be water, it does have water there too, but it's a low probability, so you just have to recalibrate the model. And I'll show you actually what that looks like. So this is that tool that I was talking about. So if you go somewhere in Chesapeake, and what is this? Is this Chesapeake? Yeah, this is Maryland. Yeah. And so this tool, what it does is, first of all, it allows you to really quickly zoom around. And then the second thing is you can click anywhere, and then it's going to call a server that can take this input and send back the predictions. And you can hook any servers you want through an API. Now in this case, it is showing you the results of two different techniques, and you can overlay it on the data. You can change the opacity so that you can see how well these things align. You can zoom in. And here are these sort of errors we were talking about. This is real water, but this is not. No, neither one of these is real water. And when you look at this in a sharp, when I show the probabilities actually here, the color is scaled by the probability of different pixels. You can see that the model actually is not certain about that water there, and that there is some gas that it's vegetation inside, which is why this can work. Now you can compare two different models in any area. Like I can go here and see. I first have to do the opacity. Yeah, I can see how these different models work. And so now I can show you very easily why this problem is difficult. So this is Richmond captured on a different day, totally different looking, different terrain, different errors, and this is still where the training data is. This is what the NLCD looks like. This is what the nape imagery looks like. And these are the predictions from the model that you're now seeing painted over this landscape. But if I then go to somewhere like Georgia, the terrain looks very different. The first one was kind of brownish. This is kind of bluish, right?
It's not like there's any kind of pre-processing of this raw data that you could do so that like.
Yeah, we tried all kinds of pre-processing, and there are some things you can do, but in the end, there's always a possibility of variation. Yeah, which is why these sort of attempts to make it really a broad model, people usually don't even try. So this is Key West, or well, one of the keys, and you can see how different that is. It's swamp really, and so now is this water, or is it a field, right?
Yeah, it's hard even for the human eye.
Yes, unless you're from there, or unless you've stared at it for a while, then you can do it, right? Here is, I think this is in Colorado someplace.
Is this open source?
Is this open source? What do you mean by that? Can you play with? Yes.
It's not the same thing.
We're just talking about this.
You can play with it, yeah.
This looks really cool. Oh my god.
Although I don't
like
know
how
why
it
it has.
does the label real time.
Right.
Nebojsa, do you think like doing that is the right way to tackle the problem of uncertainty, where you essentially you're trying to reduce the entropy in its predictions by having like another linear layer, and
No,
you know?
no, I don't think so. That's just an example of how what you can do, but it's not the best thing you can do. And so I'm going to show you what are the other things you could do. So the point here was that there's such a huge variation, but it doesn't mean that predictions from your network are wasteful. And we knew that in machine learning before. Like people take an ImageNet pre-trained model and try to retrain it on something else. But the real question here is what Chesapeake did with giving us new labels. Was that the best way, where they pick a few patches and label every pixel? Or should they do something smarter than that? In fact, what I didn't show you here in the model, and I forgot to show you, is that when we were making these things, one of the things was okay, so this is maybe a good example. So here I'm seeing water here, right? And there is no water, right? Now I could get some new data from there, but also what I can do is to say to the algorithm there's no water there, and then there will be less water there, right? And the idea here is that I can directly manipulate the weights in my last layer to reduce the probability of something, right? Instead of, so I can manipulate this map by using sliders of some sort of brain damage, editing things in the brain, or I can manipulate this by adding labels that I care about.
Kind of like computer, like machine teaching.
Yes, exactly. So sort of like machine teaching, right? And so what are the things you can do? Well, there are these latent parameters in the model that you can adjust in different geographies. For example, class biases, as in the demo here, dropout configurations, which I'll show you in a moment. Because what you can do is take this model and just erase certain neurons at random, do it 20 times, show the 20 versions to a user, and the user picks one, and that works, right? The nice thing about that is that now you have these coordinated changes that we were talking about before, right? So now it isn't that you are just changing the probabilities of that in the last layer. You're going to turn all the roads into rivers and vice versa. That's the sort of thing that happens. Now the other thing you can do is to simply look at the level below, where you have 64 features that represent every pixel, and these 64 features represent both the context of that pixel and the pixel itself, and the local textures and broader textures, whatever you were able to cram into these units. Although it turns out you don't cram that much. It seems like only 15 by 15 is captured, even though the input was 256 by 256. But you have this descriptor of this piece of land as 64 numbers. You can cluster these, or you can build a probabilistic model. You can have a mixture of factor analyzers or some sort of a real generative model of these things, and then you can operate in the latent space of that generative model. A trivial thing is you cluster them all, and then you look at the clusters and see what a certain cluster should be reassigned to different labels in the land cover. And then you can have other latent factors. You could literally have a bunch of neurons that you're allowed to swipe, or groups of neurons you're allowed to change, and then the whole picture of the state changes. Picture of the labels, label image changes. But you can also have cleverly chosen point labels, and that's what I'm going to show you next. Generally speaking, you have these models that have predict Y labels given input X, but there are these other twiddle parameters, these hidden variables H, which are to be set by some external process. And of course, you could also have intermediate features instead. Like I'm showing you these 64 levels, 64 features, not the final prediction, and then you can do something with them. The nice thing is that it's all mappable on that map, so you can visualize all sorts of things. That's what in machine teaching, the way Patrice and his group are doing it, it's kind of harder because it's all text and you have to read through things. Whereas in this application, everything is so nicely mappable, and you can use your visual system to detect things. So you can very quickly find the errors. You can very quickly correct the errors. You can very quickly reason about, you can have a theory of mind of your algorithm, where it's making a mistake, and what you need to do to make it work. So in other words, we want to automate the graduate student, right? and make it a tool for Chesapeake Conservancy people, right? So that they can do that. So here is the question that we actually recently just played with a little bit, and the question is: are humans better at finding training samples? So you go to a new area, and Chesapeake people said, well, you're making these sort of mistakes, so here are some corrections for these sort of mistakes, and then we correct the things, right? Is that better than asking our model, where are you uncertain? And then asking humans, you go and label what I tell you to do and not what you think you should do, right? And so we have enriched the tool, and it's not fully operational yet, so I'm not going to show you a live thing, but I'll show you the video.
So did random do better than your model's guess of its own uncertainty there?
Did random do better?
Yeah, it looks like yes. Or
Yeah, let's.
Looks
Yeah.
like that's what you were showing.
Yeah. The random is better than the model. Yeah.
that's
Yes.
maybe.
It's actually not surprising. Actually, Patrice mentioned that too in his talk, that it seems like active learning doesn't really buy you that much in labels, in number of labels you have to collect, because the models really don't know what they don't know. The humans know what the models don't know, which is the idea of behind machine teaching, if you can somehow make it happen, because it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
So here's the video. So it's the same tool, but with a few things added. So here Caleb goes into this area, which looks kind of weird because it has all these, I think these are the drainage channels. And so he sees that it's weird. So he knows that maybe the model is not going to do well. So he goes and clicks to see, and he sees that the model says, well, this looks like a road, right? It's a system of roads. And so then he looks at a few places like this, verifies that this is what's going on, and there's also some extra water. And then next he's going to go and say, I'm going to give you some examples of fields, forests, and so on that I choose. And what he chooses is, of course, where the errors are. And so here's an example. He is going to go in and get one of these things and label it as field in a moment. Yeah, here he says field, and then goes here and clicks in a few places. And so now that's your example of field, right? That you can add to retrain the model. And here he's still only going to do that 4x4 matrix, nothing else. And then here he says this is not water. First he did the opacity thing to figure out whether it's not water or it is water. But then the next thing he does, which is because he's a grad student, he says, well, I better give it some examples where it didn't make mistakes because it might now predict everything field, right? So then he goes, well, these are the correct impervious pixels, and let me find some example of water. There's the water. Here's an example of correct water. And so it tells you this is water. These other things that I told you are not water, but this is water, so that he doesn't get a degenerate solution, right? And then he retrains, right? Now, what I just described from the point of view of a graduate student isn't something that somebody who's an environmentalist or a high school student wouldn't understand at some intuitive level. That's why it said theory of mind. Like, now it thinks it's all fields because I didn't give it examples of correct field or correct water and so on. So then that's something that humans can understand. You don't have to be a grad student for that. And so now these things start to get better, right?
This is just retraining that matrix.
Just that matrix, yes.
On what data? Only this data that we created?
Yes, only on that data. Only on that.
Like only on these squares that you're right?
Yes, only what you just saw.
That
And
means
so-
you're still relying on the low-level features.
It's relying on what's learned before. It's just trying to make minimum changes so that things still work on these new things. And so this is the graph here that you already saw and processed faster than I could move on to the video. So using the uncertainty of the model to choose which things we want the labels for wasn't nearly as good as just randomly choosing pixels without even knowing whether there was a mistake there or not, and then saying, well, correct these things. But when Caleb chose those points, then this is number of labeled pixels versus the correction, and that goes up very quickly. And as we were pointing out repeatedly throughout this whole thing, it's only those 4x4, the 4x4 matrix, and it's clearly not what we want to do, right? I mean, we want to do much more than that.
Because over here, the problem when you rely on the network entropy is because you're saying, hey, look at the points where the network is saying it's uncertain, but actually you need to correct the errors where it gives a very wrong prediction with very high confidence. That's
right. Which is, the model doesn't know what does know. So that's the idea. So, but what's interesting here, what I was describing here, is if you think about it from the point of view of stealing this knowledge from human and distilling it into the network, right? The network is the same. Like there's not a big difference there at all. It is how you transfer that knowledge from the human into the network that matters. And so that's completely different from the usual paradigm. You have the label, that's fixed, that's it, and now just do the training on it.
Does it help so to add extra labels, like for example, now you can't tell like land, like the forest with water, but if you have an extra label that's called shadow, for example.
Yes, you could yes, you could do that. You could, and that's another place where you can now imagine how you could build that tool.
Yeah.
That any labels you want to give, you can give, and any predictions that are being predicted, other algorithms that come into the play afterwards can use, because you can also stitch algorithms together. You can say, well, he has algorithm here, a shadow prediction here, I'm going to use that as input for this, for the next thing. Or you can just have a top layer that uses predictions for different algorithms, different classes, in order to predict this is swamp. Because
Right.
that's what people want. They don't want these 4 classes, they want to predict that it's a swamp.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Presumably the
So
part-
all of that you can very easily add now, because
Yeah.
all you need is this level of abstraction, that there are these algorithms that are making predictions for certain classes, but also you can peek into the features before, and then you train the top as you go to predict new things that you just described.
Right, yeah. I was actually thinking like that exactly, as well as it might make model make fewer errors, because presumably when it does make the error, like the difference between water versus forest is not that high, like it's not that big, the difference. So if you have some other like label, it's like, oh yeah, it's probably
Right.
using shadow more likely.
Yes,
than-
yeah, you can get the structured, what
Yeah.
Patrice was calling structured labels that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, so I'm actually doing the less serious kind of computer vision, like you alluded to, so where like I use bounding boxes. And so
Yeah.
for example, there is, so this connects back to what Hunter said about like the prior, like if there are a bunch of trees, for example, at least in a lot of
Yeah.
the examples you show, if you're able to detect there are trees, then that probably gives you a higher prior for shadow over water.
Right.
And,
Right, but and
Like-
deep learning people argue that that's something models should have learned. But
well, it
doesn't.
depends on, right, you're having a,
So-
but you have a like segmentation model, you don't have a detection model, and segmentation model inherently.
No, I know, but in the
goes with
features,
different-
it's supposed to figure out that if you have grass here and forest here and then a dark stripe, then that's a shadow, and that's field. But if you had impervious and then shadow, then it's impervious. So that's something that these models presumably should,
Right, it
but
should.
but you can't really train them with gradient descent.
Right, yeah, I'm thinking like if we explicitly say
Yes,
that
you
there
can-
are trees,
yeah.
and by maybe you'll
Yeah.
enforce the
Yeah.
signal strong,
Yeah.
more strongly.
Yeah, so you'll see by the end where I'm going with all of this. But there are also indirect pieces of information. Like you can have OpenStreet, for example, that gives you information about the class you want, but also gives you indirect information about classes you don't care about. Like you can infer wetlands, right? Even though nobody labels it as such. But then there are all these geotagged photos that you could be using in some way. The really cool one is the iNaturalist. Have you guys heard about this? This is very cool. You should go to iNaturalist. You can download an app for your iPhone, and then you can take a picture of anything and then upload it, and people will tell you what it is. And there are, yeah, yeah.
Palm tree identified when I was
Yeah,
doing it.
there you go. So people will tell you what it is, and if there are also computer vision algorithms trained on all this data, so the algorithm might tell you what it is before people tell you. But then if multiple people are confirming a label, then it becomes research grade label, so they'll say this is that kind of type of pound, right? Now, what's interesting there, they're geotagged, and so you actually have 63,000 observations, point observations in Chesapeake. And that data can be, is like the point data that Caleb was doing, but indirect. It doesn't say this is road, but it tells you that here's a grasshopper here, right? And so, and in the US, there's a lot. There's millions of observations.
Is the geotag accurate enough?
There are some, what I'm showing here in Chesapeake are the ones that are accurate at 1 meter resolution. There are some which are less accurate, but they come with the uncertainty. And this is in US. And how is that useful? Well, I already alluded to it. So here's an observation by iNaturalist made here. And if you look at this with your human eye, you can tell this is a river. But if you look at this area here, just
I
like this,
actually couldn't tell
the way algorithm would be looking at it like this, it looks like a city, right?
Yeah.
And then these other things. I mean, if you've seen a lot of these satellite images, you're gonna say, okay, so this is white water, and it's be nice for rafting, right?
Yeah.
But you know, you can imagine it's a hard thing for algorithm. And in fact, our algorithm will often think of this as impervious.
Right.
but there is an observation there, right? And that observation is the Pacific salmon or a trout. and there's even an image of what was captured there, and the image is of a bunch of little salmon here, right? And there's even a description saying found in a small group of 12 salmon staying in deeper pools of the creek, right? So now I know what it is, right? And if I know what that one thing is, you saw what the point correction can do, right? Then I know this is not a road. This is a river. These are all the sightings of the sea eagles and fish-eating eagles in the Seattle area, right? And you can see where they are. If you've seen one of those, then there's water nearby, right? But all species are informative. In wetland species, you have all kinds of plants and animals like rushes that will grow only where it's very wet. And then you have water snakes, frogs, birds that like wetlands, and they can be imprecise indicators. They might be close to a certain type of land, or they might be all over different types of land. So you know that there's this % chance that it's wetlands. Then plants, like people like to take pictures of flowers, but many of these flowering plants are actually growing as undergrowth in the forests, whereas the field flowers, the meadows, right, are different types. And what you have here is the whole taxonomic tree for every one of the species. So you go up the level in taxonomy wherever you want, wherever is the most informative. And then, to me, the most interesting thing is just mushrooms, because fungi actually are these superorganisms. They're huge. They're in the ground, in the dirt, and the mushrooms are just the fruit from the fungi. So and they will fruit at certain times of year, usually after lots of rain, but when it's sunny, and it'll be at the edge of the forest. Some of them, others are going to be inside the forest. So just the fungi themselves, the sightings of fungi combined with the imagery, will tell you all kinds of things. And remember, we are after more than 4 classes. We started with 4 classes. But you can imagine having a joint model of appearance and species and creating clusters of land, which describe not only what you see from above, but what's in the dirt, what's in the forest, what's in the air. So you can have these additional classes, which is ultimately what people are after anyhow. Now, so these are the point inputs. They could be concrete point corrections, or they could be indirect point inputs. And I showed you one example of using the sliders and retraining the top and so on. But what are the other things you can do to retrain the model with all this data? And so one of the things is that you can pick, for example, this layer here, and at random just zero out a bunch of neurons. And when you do that, then you get multiple different classifications. So these are the probabilistic, and these are the corresponding max predictions.
So we can see the cursor. At least I can.
Yeah.
Unless I'm missing it.
So these are the probabilistic predictions, and these are the most likely class predictions, and these are just the same model, just different dropout patterns. And you can see that several models will think of the beach as field, which may be reasonable given what it knows.
Yeah.
But some will see it as concrete, as impervious, which you could also argue is reasonable because in Washington State, at least in some places, you can drive on the beach, you're allowed to, and they're considered roads. But then there are some that think all of this is a swamp, right?
But what's the probability of the dropout?
What is the probability?
Yeah.
Well-
Basically, the neuron gets dropped out with the probability.
No. This is not a training procedure. This is after the model was trained.
After. Okay.
Then we pick 10% of the neurons in some layer and we drop them out at random. And then we do that 9 times. And then you get these examples. Now you could say, I think, I don't know, this one is maybe the best. Then you add that, and you start from that model to do all these other refinements we're talking about. You can do backpropagation through it, or you can do refinement of the top layer, or whatever you want
How
to
do
do.
you pick the best? How do you, what's
You
the
look.
best?
You
Oh,
look.
you actually have to look. It's not like
Yes.
based on the probability that's output.
Well, you could do it like if you have iNaturalist data, right?
Right.
You could see which one matches the best
Yeah.
if you already have some data. But what I'm talking about is if you're going to have this extra information, then how do you refine it? Well, using these different dropouts is one way, right?
Right.
And this is actually going mostly towards human in the loop, right? So the humans are going to look around, identify the area, and say, I'm not happy with it. And it says, well, here are the 8 different versions. Do you like one of those? And the human can say, I don't like either one of them, any of them. But I'll give you some examples of how to retrain. Or they'll say, well, this one is pretty close, and here are some examples of how to retrain, and so on.
So when you
Yeah.
so when you drop off few neurons and you get these images, what do you do then? Like when you choose the best, and then what do you do?
Well, when you choose the best, one thing you can do is, I'll mention that later, but one thing is you can say, well, I've chosen the best, now I assume that this particular dropout version of the model is the one that I should apply in this area, right? So you've kind of very quickly fixed up a large block of things, and you can go somewhere else and pick another one, and now you can have a sort of a spatial interpolation between these
So
things.
you heat these neurons zeroed out?
Zeroed out, yeah.
When you retrain as well?
No, you just when you retrain,
When you
yes,
retrain
yes,
as well,
yes,
you keep
yes,
it,
yes.
So
So when
different
you-
models, different areas. Sorry.
We're about to ask the same question.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think. I was going to say, when you are making your whole map,
Yeah.
how do you decide how big of a region to apply one model in?
Well, open research question, but the idea is that humans are going to be there in the loop, right? And they're going to be, you do this, and then you say, well, what happened now? And you look at the larger area, right? And you say, well, it works up to here. It's here, I have to do some more work, right? So the other thing you can do is to look at to surface the features themselves from the 64, features at the layer before, or some other features, and show them to the user. Now, you can't show them to the user without somehow turning them into colors that the user can understand, right? So here I'm showing an example of a tile. It's 6 by 7 kilometers, and this is the NAPE imagery. And the labels actually were not correct in this area all that well. They didn't do a very good job labeling, and one of the reasons there are these systematic errors is that terrain like this has texture, and their initial polygon classification would say that it's forest and didn't spot it, and so it ends up being forest, right? But then if you take the representation of if you just look at the 4 pixels, 4 channels of the pixel themselves and cluster them, you will immediately see the clustering doesn't, at the pixel level, doesn't agree with this difference in labels, right? But if you take the 64 channels at the very end of the network, which are used for classification, then you get an even clearer picture that these things are fields, right? So you can now imagine also having a user feedback that just says that, like use this cluster, call this cluster a field, and that also you can represent using a network that, well, it's slightly different than a neural network, but you can make a model like that. It says if you based on how close you are to these different exemplars, you label these clusters as fields. So
in a
now,
way, are
yeah.
you training like a conditional switch to select
Yes.
what sort of architecture to use?
That's right. That's right. So there are all these things you could do, and you can imagine that again, a grad student competing in a Kaggle competition would be trying all of these things, right? And these are the sort of usual suspects, and then they would eventually get some results that work well. The danger is that another grad student, the next in the best list, is doing exactly the same thing, and that's a waste of time, waste of energy. We don't want them to do the same thing. We want them to do different things, right? And so the way you can think about this is that in all of these cases, we had a probabilistic model that predicts the labels given the inputs, but there are also these extra variables in the model, right? And you can even fine-tune, choose the configuration of these extra variables in the model based on some extra labels that humans are giving, or you can expose somehow the control to the humans for these labels. But one of the things you can do is to say that I want a spatially varying ensemble of all these models. And here I'm just saying something very simple and linear, but it could be a nonlinear ensemble of things, combined with different levels of the architecture. But for example, you have a weight that depends on the location for each model, and for each model you're using different types of hidden variable configuration, like different dropout or different adjustments of these sliders or whatever you're using as twiddle factors. And then the prediction is something like that. And then you can retrain on point estimates or something like this. And so now the question about the geography, that location model is the thing that the smoothness over these weights across the locations is what you can control to get the whole geography done. Now, the other thing you can do here, though, is you could say that all these models are reasonable, even if you're taking these ensembles of dropout patterns, which seem to be very different. They're all kind of reasonable. And what you want is that they agree with each other as much as possible, but certainly agree with the human labels. And so you can twiddle all these parameters to accomplish that wherever possible they agree with each other, so you change all of their own parameters so that they agree, but all of them together have to agree with the human labels, and this is how you can automatically also get this ensemble of things to work. Now, as you're getting the new labels that people are clicking around, you also can do sort of a backward look into all of the stuff that you've done, and you can compute the value of every one of these models and value of every one of the previous labels. So you can compute the value both of a human and the algorithm in bits, right? And so then in the end, instead of having a winner who got the best overall result, everybody gets a few bits, right? And so that's the idea behind this great land rush of this year or next year, where you have a few machine learning teams. We talked to Yoshua Bengio's lab and the MIT lab and some other places which would be contributing algorithms here as well. And then there are conservation researchers, government planners, interested parties who would also come in and help with labeling effort or evaluation effort and so on. There are various other stakeholders because somebody also offered undergrad students to work on this for credit, right? In the class, right? So all kinds of people who would want to come in and play with this. And so what you then get is that tool becomes a place where people play. Like you can come and contract, like ask, I need this land labeled. And you can even start labeling it yourself with these tools, right? Because you can take one of these bad models and try to recalibrate and say, this is roughly what I want. I have a class which is called shadow, or I have a class which is called land cover, because I actually want to detect shadow over the water, for example. That's important to me. And these are the sort of things you have a little description, you have some examples, you fine-tune a first model, and you say, I want it all done, right? And then people come and start working on it. As they're working on it, everything is logged. And so now you can compute those bits, and you can maybe automatically also create tables for people's papers, right? So that they will be really motivated to do this. But also the whole thing actually is serving a purpose to these people who want this type of land. And what we thought the first thing would be, let's just get a really good map of the United States in these 4 categories. Instead of a competition that workshop we had in the workshop last year, this is now a collaboration challenge, not a competition challenge. And the goal is to get a much better map than what we already have, those 4 classes across the United States. Let's see how quickly we can get to that with a small number of however many people are interested in working on it. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to remember that there are many more types of labels beyond the 4 that I talked about, and that there are much more data coming in. And then there are applications like change that I haven't really touched upon. What's the best way to detect that there was real change there? And this problem is going to explode. More groups are getting interested in this. I was surprised to find out Yoshua Bengio's lab is interested in it. In land cover mapping, because of the social good kind of aspect to it, a lot of the AI groups are now looking for ways to apply machine learning in places where it's not as tricky as Facebook or Twitter, but at the same time you feel like you're actually saving the planet rather than causing harm. And and as I mentioned, the new startups are starting up all the time with this. With capturing this sort of data, so I suspect there's going to be a huge revolution in this, and that in a few years you'll see a lot of papers on land cover mapping in CVPR and NeurIPS. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just had this idea in which you can try to capture these images at different seasons at different
Yes.
times, and that will actually give you different perspectives because
Yeah.
like shadow and like
Yes,
well, they
yes.
change differently, and
Yeah.
if you are able to use the same like of the same land like same area but different seasons, like
That's
that
right.
will give the model a lot of
Right,
clue
right.
about what it is.
Yeah, and we're getting some of that from Planet Labs. We're getting some of that with Landsat. We already have it, but at the low resolution. So there's a set of problems here which are really about this data and getting it done, and then there's the set of problems which are more about this hybrid intelligence, which is actually quite exciting on its own. If you could show, for example, like the graph that I showed about human choosing what to do rather than a machine telling it what to do, how much better results you get, or if we can show that there is a variation in skill, that as you use this tool you get better and better at classifying new area, and not only that you get better and better at classifying new area, but you're working on this tile and it works further away from that tile than for other people because you've learned how to do it, right? And that gets to that point also that I was talking about before. Now you have basically the same algorithm, but 10 different people get much different mileage from it, which then shows that fact that I was alluding to before at the beginning, that it's really not the algorithm, it's the student who's working on the algorithm. And these are things that people kind of suspect but are not measured. But it would be kind of cool to measure it and show it, right? And also turn everything around the effort, the human effort, and how much it's amplified, rather than the human effort comes for free, it's for granted, somebody's going to pay for that thing to happen. We have this data, and now the machine learning algorithm is supposed to learn so well that it's better than the humans. Now we don't need humans anymore. Instead, you represent this as a task of, since it's in the end always a human, always a hybrid intelligence, as I was saying at the beginning, then how do you make this hybrid intelligence as good as possible from the get-go and treat it as such a problem rather than a machine learning problem?
I have a question.
Yeah.
This seems like a really big effort, collecting the data
Yeah.
and stuff. So how do you try to overcome the whole mindset of tabula rasa training? Because this is like a living data set,
Yeah.
and you also want your models to be living.
Yeah.
So do you have any ideas on how that'll be achieved?
Well, this is that tool, right, is the visualization tool, and making it open source, making it public for everyone. At the moment, we're not planning to open it for everyone because I don't want anybody to go and paint dick pics in Iowa or whatever with our land
I was
cover.
going to ask about that.
But we're going to open it to collaborators for that challenge.
Right.
And we're not going to advertise it like come and mess with our tool.
Yeah.
But eventually, you want to make it public for everyone to come in and play, and then things are supposed to grow on their own.
No, essentially you want that low-level architecture to be shared by everyone, but
Yeah.
you just don't want everyone to just keep adding layers and layers, and
Right.
so.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the answer to that is biology, right? The biology is messy. Like it just uses whatever solutions are there. It doesn't, and sometimes it invents the solutions, but it's not trying to be most elegant. However, things that are not useful drop out. So if at some point it turns out that even though it was very useful to start with our algorithm, at this point it's not being used anymore in predictions, then we don't need to expose it unless somebody asks specifically for it, right? So it can stay thin, so to speak, as things evolve.
So we talked last time about when you and I spoke about not wanting to just have feed-forward computation, right?
Yeah.
You want sort of, like in that river
Right.
example, when you find
Yeah.
like, oh, there's a fish here,
Yeah.
so now that pixel is not a road, it's a
Yeah.
river. But
Yeah.
that means everything else should be a river too. And because the river flows over here, that tells you
Right.
that, oh, that's not road either. And a whole bunch of, and so it captures my idea of a mind where information flows in all directions at once.
Yes.
Not just activations this way, gradients that way, done. Constraint propagation is the place where I've seen this,
Mhm.
where logic networks, you throw like one new statement at this thing, you say this statement is true, and then okay, tell me what else is true in the whole
Right.
system. I know how to do that in logic programming, no idea how to do that with neural networks. The question is, do you just put that on top as like an extra twiddle feature, or do you actually put it into the training of how this thing works?
Yeah, I think I'd put it on top because a lot of this training is unnecessary. One thing I didn't talk about, but you've probably heard or seen this, when you train these networks, the first 3 or 4 layers are the same, whatever the labels are at the top. They are really learning the distribution of the input data. And so you don't want to create a very complicated thing that you're going to train end to end when the first 10 layers are baked in. I mean, they're going to be baked in. They're really, the gradient descent cannot really overtrain over them. So, like for example, one of the problems we had was that the model couldn't even learn. If you give it, if the label that we gave it is this pixel's IR greater than R, that's the label, which you can implement with a single layer neural network easily. But if it's a 10-layer neural network, it can't learn that. It can learn it for 95%, but not 100%, because what the first 10 layers are learning is almost like a components of the image, like the statistics of the input. Learning like all these filters are about what are the sort of things you see in images. They're not about what are the sort of things you see in the images that are useful for my label. They're just what are the sort of things you see in the images. And so because of that, I think all of that logic like this, really you want to put sort of towards the top and just add into the thing. But that's the part which is the most intelligent though, right? That's the area where you do want to kind of work at that level of, that's where you can do the reasoning, explaining away and so on, rather than dealing with millions of pixels. So yeah, you can, that's where you put that.
I'm not sure if it makes sense, but I just got this idea. So if you have this tool where people kind of, when you go to a new area, they click on the spaces where there is a mistake for the network.
Yeah.
You could also just try to give on that new data, have another model that will kind of try to learn what humans do, and maybe not on its own, but at least to give, like once you train it from a lot of data and you go to a new area, and with a few samples from human, it would just like suggest, maybe you should look here, there could be a mistake over there.
Right.
And
Yeah,
stuff like that.
actually,
Yeah.
that's no idea. My idea was use GANs actually to adversarially train and then concurrently train the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there is so if you look at, did I just kill it? No, here. So if you are here, right, and you don't have to click, you can actually download the whole map and look and slide and so on, and you can immediately see that there is a problem. But if you're all the way out here, then you don't know necessarily that there should be a problem in this area, right? So that's where that idea is helpful, that you somehow figure out where there could be a problem, but you flag a big area of land, and then you let the human's eye work their magic, because the human eye is way faster, right, in finding these things. But to figure out that the whole area has a problem, that you can do using computation. For example, you can look at the iNaturalist data. It will flag that there's a problem in this whole area. Or you can look at the NLCD data that's going to tell you, well, you think it's a forest, but this says it's agriculture, so maybe you should look there. So there could be. The other thing I didn't actually touch upon at all, which is a very interesting area in computer vision, and this really lends to it, is the multi-resolution analysis of these things. Because from here, you can see where the roads are, right? And now knowing that there are roads there, if you zoom in, it becomes easy to understand what else is there. So you need to really analyze this from multiple resolutions. The idea that your convolutional network, when you feed 256 by 256 image, is going to figure out these layers of what's at a very high, what's at a very low resolution, what's at a high resolution, and so on, doesn't really happen that way. So making explicit multi-resolution models that are looking at kilometer by kilometer, and then going down, is very interesting, and that's where you can have that a loop where you're going up and down in reasoning.
I don't quite know if this is the best way to integrate that into neural networks, because, if you're training them, just, like, are you going to train these things together, or are you going to train them separately, and then just sort of stick them together in some hard-coded way, some algorithm? Like,
no, you're going to learn how to put things together.
okay.
But the components might not need to be retrained. That's what we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also train the whole model. Like this really lends itself to interesting attention models, because you're supposed to make reasoning about things at a very low resolution from here, from bird's eye, from satellite. You detect this is a city, right? you take these are the main roads, you kind of have an idea where neighborhoods are, everything, and then you zoom in, and then you might zoom out again, and so on. So you can have the. Anyhow, there's a lot of sort of real computer vision thing to do here, but then there's also this other kind of hybrid intelligence research you could do because and it's mathematical actually. I didn't go through the math, but this whole idea of assigning credit in bits and so on, you can actually develop that into a framework.
Okay, let's thank him.